Okay, we've got Thomas Mlsna on the podcast today. Thomas is the owner of Untamed Ambition as well as Whitetail Ambition. He has a consulting company that works with people on habitat management on their land and also works specifically with whitetail hunters in terms of setting up their land to optimize it for hunting. I heard Thomas on a couple other podcasts. Love his approach. He's very data-driven and uses what he calls the scientific method to drill down and figure out how to target the buck you're after, how to really analyze and evaluate the area that you hunt, how to actually understand your property, how bucks move in and out of your property, how your property fits into the bigger ecosystem, everything around it. We spent a lot of time talking about hunting small parcels. There's a ton of information right now out there on big public land hunting, but there's not as many people talking about the challenges that go around hunting smaller parcels, whether it's lease property or private property that you may have access to. So that was a big part about what we talked about. I think you're going to find it both entertaining as well as super educational. Enjoy the podcast. Please give us a like and subscribe. We're on YouTube. Whether you're watching this on YouTube, you can also watch the video version of this on Spotify if you prefer that platform. And then the audio version is on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, and all the other platforms. Thanks for being here. Appreciate you. Enjoy the podcast. All right. We've got Thomas Mlsna on the podcast this afternoon. Appreciate you being here today, brother. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thomas, you own the Untamed Ambition, and you also own Whitetail Ambition, which is your whitetail consulting side of your company. And then the Untamed Ambition, is that more your media content creation side, or what specifically works under that heading?
The Untamed Ambition is the broader company, which is focused on habitat consulting primarily. So, habitat across the board kind of follow the same general concepts. We're promoting as much native habitat and sustainable habitat management. That's the primary objective there. The goals just shift a little bit. So I work with backyard bird enthusiasts or people just trying to restore their little piece of heaven, all the way up to hunters and actually agricultural producers that are trying to bring in some diversity or, again, protect those ecosystems on their property. Right in the center of that would be the whitetail guys, the recreational property owners. That's why I have a very specific program where I do more hands-on consulting on the habitat and then coaching on the whitetail side of things within that Whitetail Ambition program. And that's where my passion is, right? I'm a very fanatic whitetail hunter, but more importantly, I think that whitetail hunters and recreational property owners that have this motivation or ambition to pursue high quality hunting experiences, I feel like they're a lot more motivated and a lot more willing to invest time and money to improve the habitat on their property. So that's what that program really encompasses.
Okay. That was actually going to be my next question. What percentage of your business is focused around whitetail, and then what percentage of it is focused around other aspects of environmental, change and environmental maintenance and creation? I'd say 80-20 on the front of that. But it's a harder question to answer because a lot of clients call me because of deer, right? Mm-hmm. And then once I leave the property, they're more focused on a lot of other things. And it kind of brings up a good point. When it comes to property management or habitat management, the habitat itself is what creates opportunities. So if we focus on high quality native habitat management, we're going to produce high quality native animals, right? And whitetail deer are part of that. So the hunting side of things really just comes in when we start fine tuning or adding the strategy to the layout or the design of the property. If we're going to regenerate an area, do we want thicker cover here, or do we want it there? Do we want more transitional areas here, or do we want them there? Do we want more attractive food sources here, or do we want them there? Based purely on keeping pressure off the property, essentially, right? Can we get in and get out of there and hunt that property while giving those deer, specifically mature bucks, security that they need and want so that they stay on the property, stay in the surrounding area, and then it increases our level of opportunities on that property. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so what do you think the percentage of people that end up over on the whitetail coaching side, What percentage of those people are people who are hunting land that they actually have the opportunity to improve and do habitat management around versus people who are basically on a property, whether they're leasing it or they're hunting somebody else's property that's given them permission, but they really don't have the opportunity to make improvements in the habitat, and they basically have to hunt what they have to hunt?
So I do on-site, in-person consulting and coaching, and then I also do virtual stuff. So if we separated those, it'd be a little bit easier. On the virtual side, it's probably 50-50, like almost right down the middle. And that's why I do offer that virtual consultation, where you have a lot of guys that hunt leased ground or permission-based only, or even public land where they have zero control over the habitat itself. The habitat's still important, right? Being able to assess the habitat or identify different types of vegetation is going to be effective in teaching you where deer are going to be during certain times of the year. What is the food value there? What is the cover value there? That's really important. But I would say on the virtual side, it's pretty even right down the middle. Half the guys just want the hunting strategy. They want to learn a little bit about habitat. And then the other half of the guys want to understand the hunting strategy, but be thinking, how can I improve the habitat along the way? And actually, my program that I run, if you run purely on the virtual stuff, typically what we'll do is we'll build out the whole design element on the property. Again, we ask a lot of questions and try to glean as much information out of the client as possible. But ultimately, we create this map, which is the end goal of what we want your property to look like, as far as, again, the vegetative structure on the property, all the way down to the management units and how we're going to execute that actual plan. The roadmap to get there is what I refer to as the plan, right? We'll lay it out, break it down, manageable chunks on a multi-year timeline, and how we're going to do that. And more often than not, if it is purely virtual, we'll locate a regional biologist, forester, most of these are state resources that are free anyways, and we'll hand them this plan that we have, and they'll look at it and they'll put their 2 cents into there. They'll agree or disagree with certain areas based on what they see on the ground, because they'll actually be the local boots on the ground habitat consultant or assessor in that situation. So we can pull a lot of that together. On the other side, on the in-person side, it's about probably 90-10 split. 90% of the guys that hire me to come to their property and walk it own the property. They're ready to make a big change. But I still do have probably 10% of those clients that purely lease the property. Generally, in that situation, they lease the property and they know the landowner pretty well. So a lot of times we'll go in there and we'll put together a kind of a hypothetical plan, like, oh, we could do all these things. That would be really nice. And then they kind of softly present it to the landowner. And a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, these habitat plans account for the financial side of things. That's really important to me, because I don't like to hand someone a plan to completely revamp their property and then say, oh yeah, this is going to cost you $50,000 a year for the next 5 years to do this, right? Especially on a recreational property that rarely has income or obvious income opportunities.
Yeah, I could definitely get you down in here on this property that I'm on. That would help me a ton. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, because this feeds into what you were just referencing, on a lot of the podcasts right now, you hear a ton of conversation about, public land hunting, which is really in vogue right now, especially mobile, and people that have all this space. They can make a lot of mistakes. If they burn a spot, they can go use another one or find another one. But there's so many of us that are hunting. The reality of us is we're hunting smaller properties that have a lot less tolerance for mistakes, a lot less tolerance for pressure. And I'd love for you to talk about some of the challenges that surround smaller properties that you cannot manage. So the ones that we were just talking about, lease properties, a property where somebody's given you permission, and you may have 60 acres, 100 acres, maybe 130 acres, but it's, a minimal footprint in the grand scheme of things. And there's so many other things that go into now, whether you overhunt that, put too much pressure on an area where you get a lot of traffic, anything like that. What are the specific challenges that come around hunting a piece of property like that?
Pressure is number one right there, right? So the way I coach, I use this what I refer to as the scientific approach to hunting strategy, which simply put, it's just a way for us to learn about any specific situation by collecting information and then using that information to create theories. And then essentially all we're trying to do is prove or disprove theories. So with that being said, the more information that you have, the more precise your theory can be. And with that comes, the amount of time or experience on any given property. So right out of the gate, that's one of the things I always like to let people know or get people to understand. I know people are always, in this Amazon one-click ship world, right? We're always looking for this instant gratification.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, like my virtual calls, even on-site property visits, a lot of times there will be perspective shifts, right? Or these little nuggets of information that kind of change how the client looks at the situation or gives them that kind of aha moment. And all of a sudden like, oh, I should do this differently or fine tune this or that. But more often than not, habitat or the habits that we employ when we're hunting, those things change over time. And the longer you're on a property hunting it, whether, again, you can do habitat improvement or you're leasing it and you're kind of just working with what you have, but the longer you're there, the more information you're going to collect, from experience, from trail camera data, from firsthand observations from the stand or glassing fields, or just being out scouting the property and things that you notice throughout the year. All of those things come into play to understand the cause and effect on how that property functions. But I use that scientific method, and within the research step, which is kind of the step number 2, you're trying to, again, collect information or scout. I try to categorize and catalog things the easiest way possible. And obviously, there's an unlimited amount of variables involved when it comes to collecting information and putting together theories on what a mature buck is going to do. So I break it down, every single aspect, every single variable can fall into one of these 4 categories or 4 elements that I refer to them as the 4 key elements, which is wind, pressure, food, and timing. Wind is king. You have to obey the wind, right? On many different levels, you have to obey the wind, and you don't really have control over it. You have zero control over it. But you do have control over how and what you do given any certain wind direction, right? So wind is king, and that's the first of those 4 key elements. The second one, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt. One of the challenges that I run into, and I know talking to other people, especially when they have a smaller piece of property, is that very frequently there may only be a few areas on there that have a lot of traffic or whatever that you've once you start to dial it down, and they all seem, or very frequently seem, to respond to the same wind. And so, you're in this finite amount of land, and you can only hunt these spots on the same wind, whether there's 3 or 4 good spots, and they all, I can hunt all of them on a, southwest wind. And 80% of the time or 70% of the time you're getting a north wind or some kind of a northern wind. And so now you're then you start to push things. I think just this is human nature, right? It's like we want to be in there, and you don't get, you got 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by, you're not getting any kind of the wind that you're looking for, and you're like, oh, well, maybe I'll just go push this or I'll push that, and which feeds into one of the other ones that you're going to bring up is pressure. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I do agree with you. Is that wind thing is like one of those things where you're always, that you're supposed to play the wind, but I always feel like we battle our own inner demons in listening to that advice.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, and on that note, and kind of back to this scientific method and information collection, right, is I think it's very, very important for people to just be completely honest with themselves with what they do. And, if you do want to push the envelope a little bit and maybe hunt an area on a marginal wind, that's okay once in a while. But you have to take note of what you see and observe both on your way to the stand, while you're on the stand, and while you leave the stand. Because if you go in there and you're bumping deer or you just have a terrible hunt, then just take note of that. And then you'll understand it wasn't worth pushing the envelope that time. Right.
Yeah.
Now, the next time you hunt and you want to hunt on the same wind, maybe conditions are a little bit different. Maybe it's significantly cooler. Maybe it's later in the season. Maybe it's earlier in the season. There's a lot of variables at play there again. But no matter what you do, again, this kind of just encompasses this approach that I take where people ask me all the time, like, is this your style hunting? Is that your style hunting? Are you a food plot guy? Are you, I remember the first time someone brought up Dan Infault to me when I was talking about killing a buck near his bedding location. Like, oh, you're using the beast style of hunting. And I was like, what is that? And then I talked to him like, oh yeah, I guess I do employ that. But, and that's obviously a very effective way. And I've got a lot of respect for Dan, getting to know his tactics over the years. But my perception, or my take on it, or my approach has always just been, I'm going to do what works, or what I think works. Right.
Specific strategies for specific situations.
My strategies, but they change throughout the season based on what I think I have to do to get it done, essentially. So, but back to those 4 key elements. So wind is king, right?
Wind is king.
Pressure is the second one. I always say pressure limits potential. And, pressure can be caused by a lot of different things on a property. Back to what we have control over, obviously human pressure is one of the biggest factors at play there. So pressure limits potential, and on a small property, it can ruin your property very, very quickly if you're not hunting it correctly. If you push too hard, too fast at the wrong time of the year, it might burn out that spot for the rest of the year, and you don't have other options, right? You can't just pop over the hill, hunt the back corner, hunt this corner, hunt that corner, whatever it might be. And we'll circle back on that here in a second. But the third of those 4 key elements is food. Food defines movement. You need food in any given area to hold deer, or again, move them into certain areas that are more huntable. That would be more on the design element, if possible, right? If we're thinking strategically when we're making improvements to a property. And then the fourth of those 4 key elements is simply timing. And really, if you zoom out as hunters, what is our primary goal? It's essentially to figure out when and where to hunt any given location, right? So the timing thing is absolutely critical. Drilling into that, figuring out when to actually hunt, whether it's the wind direction, you're looking at a short-term timeline. Are you looking for a very specific wind direction? Are you looking for a cold front or a wind shift that's going to promote early movement and increase the chances of success on that particular hunt? Or are you looking at the timing from a much longer timeline, as far as, do I think I have the best opportunity to harvest a mature buck early in the season? Maybe it's late in the season, or maybe it's during the middle of the rut when, they're obviously a lot more active. But from my experience, and to give you a little bit of background on my hunting situation, I've talked about this before, talked about it a little bit on the podcast with Mark Kenyon. I do have access to a pretty large farm. It's broken up both by topography and, the individual properties themselves. This is a family farm that has grown over the years as other neighboring farms go out of business. We're trying to scoop up land primarily, honestly, to keep it out of the hands of people we don't want buying the land. So there's 2 things
Prevention.
there. Yeah. Well, like our entire area is full of Amish, and I get along with them a lot better now than I used to.
What state are you in?
I'm in Wisconsin.
Okay.
Southwestern
Interesting.
Wisconsin.
My family, I'm in South Carolina, but half of my family's from Southern Illinois. My wife's family's from Missouri. So really good deer country, and tons of Amish around them as well.
Yep.
So
yep. And one of the things with the Amish, and I'm not talking about their way of life. I'm not talking about them on a moral or personal level or anything, right?
Sure.
But one of the big things with the Amish community is, once they buy land, it's almost impossible to get it back from them.
It never comes back out.
Correct.
No, it's there forever.
They're very cash heavy within their community, and they actually have most of their districts, or however you want to frame that. They have rules where when one individual wants to sell his farm, and they juggle farms around all the time. Their families are growing nonstop, and the fathers and the sons and stuff, they start businesses and change businesses, and they're tradesmen, but they shuffle farms around quite a bit. But their rule is that they always have to offer it to Amish first.
Yeah, they give it the opportunity to stay in the community.
Correct. And more often than not, unfortunately, you get these bigger farms that get broken up into 10 smaller farms, and then there's 10 extra houses built, and that's a pain point from my perspective, because I'm a habitat guy, and I hate seeing habitat disappear for development, whether it's from suburban sprawl or it's Amish. So It is what it is. But yeah, so that's a big thing. And then also we have a lot of like cash croppers in the area that try to buy up land, and then they rip out all the fence lines, and they just for lack of a better terminology, rape and pillage the land. They're not there for long haul. We are a dairy farm, and I'm not going to say that we're perfect by any means, but we have a lot more long-term mindset with what we invest in that land, nutrient management programs, stuff like that. Whereas these cash crop guys, they come in and they're just trying to turn $1 that year, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, but that's the big thing. So this farm is growing, but the way it lays out is basically like a lot of small properties. And, if you look over my shoulder, those are my two biggest deer right there. One's over 200. Sorry, that one's just a touch under 200. And that one's well over 200. But both of those deer were shot on small properties. They're connected to our property. But like this one, for example, was killed on like a 15-acre easement that we own all the fields in this tiny little easement. And then there's just a tiny little patch of woods that surrounds this property, surrounded by highways on 3 sides. The other one on the other side was a very similar situation. It's like a tiny little finger of timber, basically surrounded by fields on all sides, but it connects to other chunks of timber. And, this is a big thing. And I think the most important element when it comes to hunting a smaller property is, again, that pressure aspect, and knowing where those bucks are based on historical information and really understanding the timing. I knew that my best chance of harvesting them was early in the season before pressure increased in the area, and also when they were a lot more predictable with their movements. Now, that being said, you can absolutely hunt smaller properties later in the season. It's just that the pressure changes. One of the things I say all the time in regards to pressure is that there's 2 things that reduce pressure on deer: cover and consistency. So if you think about, the fall progressing, you get deeper into season. Early in the year, there's a lot of leaves on the trees, right? Air moves less freely, noise travels less freely through those environments. So those deer feel more sense of security wherever they are. As the season progresses and those leaves fall off, crops come off, corn's harvested, whatever it might be. Now those deer are a lot more exposed. Noise, scent, all the stuff that travels with air moves a lot more freely. So they're a lot more, irritable, essentially, right? They're picking up on a lot more environmental stimulus or stimuli. So that's something to consider. Along with that is access. You can access certain areas a lot easier early in the season when you have that extra cover versus later in the season when those deer really start to bed, where they can monitor potential threats. That stereotypical buck that beds and monitors the parking lot on public ground, right? Bucks do that all the time. And they'll habitually bed where they can monitor consistent sources of pressure. And that's why I say consistency is another thing, because the more consistent activity is in an area, it gives them more of an opportunity to kind of adapt to it and just understand what's going on, what's actually affecting them, and what they can survive or work around. But when those things become inconsistent, like showing up on a property on a weekend where you haven't been there for 2 weeks, if they're bedded watching the spot that you park your truck, now they know you're on the property. And it's not that they're going to vacate the whole property, but they're probably not going to get up and move the way they would normally move when they know that there's a potential threat that just entered their bubble, right? So that's an important thing.
Look, can I ask you a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Because I've heard different schools of thought around this, right? So you hear a lot of people say, you stay out of there, you keep that place as fresh as you can until you go out and you're ready to go in and hunt it. But then I've also heard, which kind of follows, a little bit of what you're talking about, is creating some sort of adaptation to your presence. Not necessarily where you're always in there hunting them, but whether you're scouting, whether you're doing something so that when you do show up, they're not like, okay, something's different, something's wrong. So what are your thoughts around that and what the balance is there?
I think you have to look at it from a realistic perspective, right? Again, kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about being honest with yourself. And, I have this conversation, very similar conversation 50 times a week, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I do when I do like a pre-consultation call for an on-site or even a virtual, I see a structure on the property and I always ask, is that a house or is it a cabin? Or what is it? Maybe it's just a shed or something like that. I always get the same tone of response. If it's a cabin, it's always a positive tone. Oh yeah, it's just a cabin. We're only there on weekends. We're only there every once in a while. And if it's a house, it's usually a negative tone response. Yeah, it's a house. I've got one client that has a fairly large property and he leases the house out to his brother. I really can't afford the property without having someone pay that part of the mortgage, right? Like, completely understandable. I see it exactly the opposite. The more consistent the activity, the more those deer latch on, right? But one of the things I wanted to note was when I say, how important consistency is, I'll get the guy every now and then that's like, oh yeah, that's why I very consistently check trail cameras every Friday afternoon. Every Friday afternoon, my son and I jump in the side by side, we make a lap around the property. That is not consistent to a white-tailed deer, right? A white-tailed deer, from a biological standpoint, is a crepuscular animal, which simply means that they're the most active at dawn and dark, right? So think about that. How does a deer operate? Well, the sun's starting to come up. They're out in a large open destination food source or more open areas. They see the sun on the horizon, or they sense that timing, moving back towards security cover. And then on the other side, okay, the sun's starting to go down. I'm going to start heading back out towards those bigger food areas or feeding areas. And obviously there's following cover and transition areas and all this stuff along the way. But simply put, they operate on a 24-hour cycle. Sun comes up, sun goes down. It's not 7 days a week.
So what are they seeing every morning and every evening when they're in their most active stages, right? Not what do they see once a week. They're not working. They're not on a 7-day calendar like we are. They're on a 24-hour cycle that they feel.
Correct.
Versus
exactly
cognitively processing.
I was talking about this one time at a habitat camp that I did, and a gentleman in the back raised his hand, and come to find out, he actually used to be a cameraman for Lukowski's, Lee and Tiffany Lukowski.
Okay.
And he told me that they would pay people, the neighbor kid, I think primarily, but if they were gone on a trip, if they were on vacation, wherever they were, they would actually pay the neighbor kid to drive the ATV around the property every day that they were gone, because they do very consistently drive around their property with ATVs. Yeah. So to answer your question, I think it has to be kind of all or nothing. And, maybe you can get by like every couple of days. But I think at the end of the day, you have to look at that again, honestly, and understand what is actually consistent. And the deer on the property are going to tell you, they're going to respond to that. They're going to let you know, is this consistent? Is it inconsistent? And again, consistency isn't just like, well, what's happening, this fall. It could be what's the trend over a 5 or 10 year period, right? Because that's the other thing to always keep in mind is when you're making adjustments or you're trying to improve your odds, improve your opportunities on a property, whether you own it or lease it, you want to be thinking long term. I always say every year is a building year. Every year is a building year. No matter what the situation, every year is a building year. You always want to do what you can to be the most successful now, but you also want to think building year. And one of those big things is kind of playing defense on a property, right? I don't want to go in there, and I talk to guys all the time when it's like, oh, we only have 2 and 3 year old bucks on this property right now. We're making habitat improvements, or, we just picked up this lease, whatever it might be. You still want to hunt smart, because you don't want to condition those up and comer bucks to avoid certain areas during certain times of the year. You want them to be on your property from the time they're 1 or 2 years of age, all the way to the time they're at whatever your standard is that you want to harvest. You want to keep them around there and make them comfortable and get them into this consistent routine of where they are. And a lot of that has to do with the amount of pressure on a property at a certain time of the year.
And so to follow that line of thinking, I mean, I can see where you could actually, so let's take a piece of the example that we talked about in the beginning, right? You're leasing a piece of property, you have permission property, something like that, where you can't make any habitat management. But in many situations, mine is a perfect example. It's a 110 acre tract, but the same guy that owns it owns 1,700 acres, and on that other 1,600 acres or so, there's like 7 other hunters, right? That each have a small piece. So you've got people all around you hunting. And the initial thought process is, well, I can't control them. It's kind of all this is out of my control. But if I'm following your line of thinking, you actually have a lot of control over it, because if you manage yours well, not from a habitat management standpoint, but from all the other things, pressure, those kinds of things, and you create a little bit of a safe haven where you can create a situation where it's not overhunted. Is it oversimplification to think that the deer will eventually maybe come to your place more because they're less pressured, and now you've created a better environment, even though you haven't been able to manage the habitat?
Absolutely. Obviously, there's other factors involved there.
Sure.
But I think you're spot on. I mean, one of the analogies that I like to use frequently with pressure is if you envision a partially deflated air mattress and you step on that one side and all the rest of that air pushes off to one side, right? So you can put pressure on this side and it balloons out on the other side. Pressure is all relative. Now, again, cover and consistency are big things. Cover in regards to habitat is big. So where's the food? Where's the cover? If all things are considered equal, then the pressure absolutely is going to determine where those deer end up. But there's another thing that's important to note on the side of pressure, because I don't want to give your listeners the impression that if they just stay off their property, they're going to just start stacking up bucks, right? There's a limited amount of resources in any situation. So another big source of pressure that's often overlooked is herd social pressure. Simply put, how many does or antlerless deer are on that property? Because there is a finite amount of resources, no matter the situation. You might be in ag country with a plethora of food during most of the year, or you might be in an area like the big woods somewhere where there's very few like distinct destination food sources. But one way or another, resources are somewhat limited. So if you have too many deer on that property, then when those bucks come in, they're just not going to find the space that they need. They're not going to find secure bedding areas that aren't already dominated by doe family groups. They're not going to find food sources that aren't already dominated by doe family groups. And that can be a problem too. So one of the big things with habitat management, and actually something that the lease guys, the guys that are just getting permission or hunting a lease, have control over, is more of the herd management side. And I'm not talking, the crazy, like trying to dial in on genetics with cull bucks, stuff like that. But very simply, there's a lot of does on this property, and we're getting towards the end of the season here. We should probably take some does off this property. You look around the surrounding area. Is there a lot of does in general? Or, is it an area that has a lower deer population? Those are all things to consider. I'm not telling you to go out and clean house, right? But typically we strive to reduce the doe population by about 30% every year. And that just keeps you at a baseline, because, if you think about most does in a healthy environment where there's a lot of food, a lot of resources, they're going to probably have twins every single year after their first year. Maybe their first year they have a single fawn, but beyond that, they generally have twins. So 30% reduction keeps you at a baseline. And, maybe you need to increase that a little bit to hit a more healthy baseline. But that's important to note for sure, is the pressure aspect that those does put on that property.
How can you get a reasonable idea of the doe population other than, cell cameras? Because not everybody's running tons of cameras. Even more, I think more and more people are. There's almost a tendency to run fewer cameras among a lot of the people I'm talking to, because I think people have realized that they're relying too much on camera intel on a lot of the decisions they're making, and so they're either pulling back on them or they're relying on them a lot less. So in terms of trying to get your arms around your population, in the area you're hunting, what's the best way to do that?
Every area is different, right? So again, when we talk about that timing element, and specifically the food in relation to that timing element. So food sources are going to change, but one of the things I really like to do is wait until later in the season, because typically early in the season, your does are much more spread out, which is how you want them as much as possible. But later in the season, but not too late in the season. You have to specify that, because you don't want to wait until you might have the only good food source in the area, and then all the deer within 15 miles are hitting that food source. And then you look at that and go, wow, I've got a lot of does on this property, when really most of those aren't resident does. But later in the season, again, assuming that there's decent food source there, and also that the pressure is lower on that property, which, is going to hold those deer around. But I typically like to wait until a little bit later in the season, then really monitor those food sources and just kind of take note. Am I seeing a lot of does? If I'm looking out in this food source and I see, or even just observations from the stand, a point in time where you can very clearly go 1, 2, 3, 4, not a trail camera sequence where, it's the same doe family group going past there to go out and feed and coming back there to bed. And then you go, oh man, I saw 10 does on the property this morning, but really it was the same group of 5, or maybe a group of 3 that went back and forth. Right. But somewhere that you can get a very clear picture of how many does are on that property. And a lot of times later in the season, late November, early December timeframe, for me in the southwest corner of Wisconsin, I can look at a food source and go, wow, there's 25 does out on that field and there's 3 bucks. So I can see, and also I can drive down the road and see like, oh, there's another 20 does there. There's another 20 does there. So it's not like they're all congregated in one specific food source across that farm. And then it helps me really gauge the number of does. But I think it's not an easy question to answer, a straightforward question to answer, I would say, because you really want to take into consideration like what you're observing throughout the summer, throughout the fall, and then kind of use that late fall time frame to confirm that. And then the other thing too, like I said, we live in the Amish area and they typically harvest a lot of deer. And I've worked with them more directly the last 10 years. And I tell them straight up, like, shoot as many does as you want. I understand that they're primarily focused on the meat aspect of harvesting deer. They also want to kill bigger deer. So that's another thing that I was going to mention, when you're talking about leasing a chunk of land from a property owner who leases more land in the surrounding area.
Yeah.
One of the best things that you can do, if possible, is try to get connected with those other people that own or lease properties that connect to yours. And what I always say is communication creates common goals, right? Just simply having conversations with them and letting them know your management objectives, whatever they are, or your standards, whatever they are. Not saying they have to follow the same train of thought, but if you just say, yeah, I've got a lot of really nice 3-year-olds on this property. I'm really excited to see what they look like in a couple of years. And, we're probably not going to harvest a buck this year unless we see something this age class or older. A lot of those guys are going to look at you and they'll put their nose up in the air and be like, great, you pass up that 140-inch 3-year-old. I'm going to shoot him tomorrow. And that's
especially
fine.
In South Carolina. You see a 140-inch 3-year-old in South Carolina, someone's going to kill him.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And every area is different, right? It's all relative. And maybe it's a 90-inch 2-year-old that you're trying to get to make it through. So it can be, potentially 120 to 140-inch 3-year-old. Again, whatever it is. But just having those conversations with those neighbors gets them to understand like, oh, okay. And this is all coming from personal experience where, I talked to all the neighbors, and for a long time, a lot of these neighbors would just straight up say like, wow, I should have passed that deer, but if I don't shoot him, someone else is going to shoot him. And like, well, actually no one on our property is going to shoot him. We have got a 1,500 acre property, about 350 ish acres is actual hunting land. The rest is cropland, but we control a tract of land that's roughly 1,500 acres, and none of us are going to shoot it. Out of the 17 hunters, we wouldn't shoot that deer unless, by accident, which happens during gun season, right? You jump a buck and he's running away and everyone gets excited. But once those guys understand that, then they're a little bit more hesitant, or they have a little bit more self-control when it comes to pulling the trigger. At the same time, on the Amish side of things, because they don't run trail cameras, I just simply started handing them packets of trail camera photos every year and saying, hey, these mature bucks are out there. These bucks are also out there. And at first glance, they look really big. But when you look at them side by side with these pictures, you'll see this is a significantly younger deer who has a lot of potential. And these are significantly older deer that really should be taken out of the herd because they're not going to get much bigger. And, I could give you 100 reasons why shooting a mature buck is better than shooting an immature buck. One of the most beneficial things to me is there's a lot more meat on them. I mean, we were just eating venison backstraps last night, and, a backstrap on a 6-year-old deer is pretty big versus, a younger deer. So however you want to look at it. But the big point there is having those conversations with the neighbors and getting them to understand or share the same goals as you will generally shift their perspective. And it doesn't happen, again, overnight, but over time, they start to see that. And then the biggest thing, honestly, is sharing with them what your goals are, and then also sharing with them the success you have. And a lot of times, they might be a little jealous at first, but if they also understand, like, you're putting in the time to achieve a certain goal, it automatically in their mind registers as, oh, I can do that too. Right? He's right there across the fence. He's killing that caliber of deer across the fence. Why can't I do that? Because again, those deer are traveling quite a bit, no matter how big your property is. Even our property, the different valleys on that farm and how those home ranges break up from those bucks, they're only on our farm X percentage of the time. Maybe it's 80% of the time, maybe it's 20% of the time. But at some point in time, they're not on our property, they're on the neighboring property. So, it's kind of that defensive maneuver. And also, again, just thinking ahead year after year after year.
This section of the podcast is brought to you by Osseo Gear. With its one-of-a-kind Raptor camo pattern, Osseo blends seamlessly into the whitetail woods. Osseo's features and technology are designed to fit the unique needs of the bow hunter. With a lifetime warranty, Osseo is designed by bow hunters for bow hunters. Use the code DO NOT GO20 to get 20% off any order from the Osseo Gear website. Visit them at osseogear.com. Elevate your game with Osseo. So you made a comment on, it was a really good point, and I think that most of us tend not to think this way. We've got 110 acres, and we've got Onyx or whatever we're using, and we've got the outline of wherever we're hunting drawn out, and we think inside that box, right? And we kind of contextualize all the information we gather inside that box. But in reality, what you just said is these deer are traveling. They don't know boundaries. They don't know what land, where the line that separates what you're hunting versus the other guy's hunting. And really taking a step back and looking at the area that you're hunting in a much wider, like 30,000 foot viewpoint, and getting a better understanding, not just of the property you're hunting, but of how that property fits into, the jigsaw puzzle that is everything around it. And getting a much clearer understanding from that standpoint, and not just how do I hunt this, but how do I understand how deer use my property, which will in turn allow me to understand how to hunt that better. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, I employ this holistic approach, right? Specifically on the management side of things, where we're simply put, we're just trying to consider all the factors at play, right? We're not going in and managing a property specifically for deer and neglecting the birds and the butterflies and the pollinators and all those things. But beyond the habitat, we use the same exact approach when we're trying to assess the property from a hunting standpoint. So the simplification of that is we look at every property and how it's made up of multiple systems or multiple setups. So from the habitat side, we'd be looking at more of like the ecological systems. But from the hunting side, we're looking at, again, those setups. Where do I think a deer is going to bed? Where do I think a deer is going to feed? How do I get in between those two locations without them knowing and effectively hunt them? So when we start looking at a smaller property specifically, we're looking at how many different setups are on that property, in these little systems. What are each one of those individual systems? But when you're talking about a small property, the most important element there is how does that property fit into the bigger system or that bigger surrounding landscape, like you're saying. And, like the property we were looking at of yours prior to starting the podcast, and we didn't dig into any details, but to me, at a high level, it looks like a major travel corridor, right? And I think that's important because, especially with a small property, and I say this time and time again, because I'll always get guys on consultation calls or visits that almost seem like slightly embarrassed that they only have a 40-acre property. And, and I get a lot of it's probably coming from this environment that we're in right now, where a lot of guys are talking about managing huge tracts of land. But I always tell them my perfect or ideal property is a 20-acre property that's a connecting corridor between more properties. And, ideally you do have a couple pockets of security cover in there. And ideally you do have a couple of attractive food sources in there. But the most important element to hunting deer is getting deer to move in general. And if pressure increases too much in any surrounding area, or you have poor access to your property, then typically deer won't move very well. They wait for the cover of darkness, again, another layer of cover. They wait for that cover of darkness to feel secure enough to actually move through that property or throughout the property itself. So when you zoom out, take that 30,000 foot view and look at where that property fits in the surrounding landscape. Is it a travel corridor, or is it more of an end destination, whether it's where the deer are going to end up in the morning to bed or where they're going to end up at night to feed? But the most important thing is just understanding how deer move to and from or through that property And then within that property, what are those little systems? And again, a lot of that's going to be dictated by the size of the property. Do you have multiple bedding areas? Do you have multiple food sources? Do you have multiple transition areas? Or is it just one big setup in general where deer are moving from one side of the property to the other? But I think that's important to note because, again, we're trying to drill in and figure out how to hunt a property. That timing element can be very critical. And, again, on a short-term scale, do you need a very specific wind to hunt that property in general, or do you need to hunt it at a very specific time of the year? If you have a small property that maybe has a lot of early season activity, but not a lot of rut activity, then don't wait for the rut to hunt it. Get in there early season, right?
Yeah.
Take advantage of
Which would be completely antithetical to what, a lot of the stuff you hear is, on social media and everything is like, don't burn your property out, until the rut rolls around, or at least until the pre-rut, like stay out of there early. But, every piece of property is specific to, like you said, the habitat around it.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
From the standpoint of the way, and I don't know Wisconsin at all, but do you have much like swamp or marshy area?
Yeah, our habitat is very diverse. Let's say that. I mean, you go across the state, it varies dramatically. The eastern side of the state is going to be very marshy, very swampy. The western side of the state is more rolling hills and bluff country. But in that area, you will get a combination of hills, bluffs, timber on top. You go north of where I am up in the infamous Buffalo County area, and most of the tops of the ridges are timber. The bottoms are what are farmed. Down where I am, it's kind of the flip or inverse of that, where the ridge tops are farmed, and then the bottoms are generally swampy areas, cattle pastures. There's creek bottoms and whatnot, and then the hillsides, in some overlap in there, are what are covered in timber. So there's a lot of variation there.
Okay, so the reason I asked you that is a lot of my listeners are from the Southeast. I'm obviously in the Southeast. We have a lot of marshy, swampy areas. It's very flat in South Carolina specifically. And you've got these big pine thickets, in between ag land. So it's not uncommon to either have a huge pine area, but most of the time it's like you've got these pine thickets like that are surrounded by ag on two different sides. You may have a marshy area in the middle. You may have a marshy area in the side. Obviously not a specific piece of property, but can you just in general talk a little bit about some key things to be looking for as, if you have a piece of property that's marshy or swampy, or you potentially have access to one, where you start with something like that, and what are some of the key habitat elements that you should be paying attention to as you kind of scout that piece of property?
Yeah. And without digging into like the specifics as far as like, this type of vegetation or this specific plant or anything, these concepts that I preach and coach on are true across the board. And the reason I know that is because I apply them all over the place. I just got back from Wyoming chasing mule deer out there in the prairie, kind of the breaks area along the rivers. And the same concepts are there. I've hunted whitetail, coos deer in Arizona multiple times. Same concepts apply there. I've hunted whitetails in Georgia. Same concepts apply there. So, the big thing you want to look at is cover, right? Food plus cover equals habitat. So if you're in an area like you're explaining with a big chunk of pines, which, again, without knowing specifics or actually looking at it firsthand, more often than not, a mature pine stand doesn't provide a lot of food value to the deer. And, in the South, it probably provides more cover value. Up in the North here, I don't particularly like pines for cover because they don't provide good thermal cover. Which is a whole nother topic of conversation, but simply put, like good thermal cover in cooler climates, the sun needs to reach the ground. It needs to cut the wind, but the sun needs to hit the ground. So grassy cover, dappled pockets of conifers are beneficial, but a solid stand of that, basically, it holds the coldness in there as much as anything and doesn't provide much cover value that way. And then also, the branches kind of self-prune or thin out on the bottom, so air moves freely through the bottom, and there's not a lot of cover to block the wind, but also sight and provide that sense of security. But
that what you just said is very common in a lot of the Southeast. As you get very dense canopy, it can be 85 degrees in the field, and you walk, 50 yards into that canopy and it's 15 degrees cooler.
Which could be advantageous in some situations.
Yeah. And there's nothing low, you could be 10 feet high before so there's a lot of air movement, on the lower, part of that forest canopy.
Yep.
So you're describing what's very common in the Southeast.
So one of the big things that I look at there, still thinking cover, is topography. And obviously a lot of that is probably going to be relatively flat, but there are fluctuations in topography. The hill breaks off here. There's a little mound here. Maybe it's something as simple as a storm came through and uprooted a handful of trees, and over time you get kind of these like pillows or pilths in there that create little pockets. Topography is the greatest form of cover there is. It's the most consistent, most solid, and that's how I look at it more often than not. It's just topography is simply a form of cover from a deer's perspective. If they travel slightly over the crown of this hill, now they're isolated or blocked from whatever potential threat is above the hill or further up on the hill. So when you start looking at like a pine stand and maybe a swampy area and then an ag field, I'm just looking at what the cover is. Where's connecting cover? Deer are edge species, so they love to follow an edge. So wherever that transition is from different habitat types or different types of vegetation, it's going to provide generally more cover, and that creates a travel corridor. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a deer in my area traveling on the leeward side of that hill, which again is cover, or in an area like you're describing, traveling on the leeward side, the downwind side of the connecting cover, whether it's a swampy area or that pine stand, it's all cover. So that's where, again, employing this scientific approach can be employed in any situation. And I don't even have to be well versed on that. It's just you analyzing it, thinking of these main concepts, and then kind of plugging in the details as you go and objectively learning what you're seeing on the ground. But the big thing I wanted to say there was, in a situation like that, you really have more of a separation of the food and cover. If you have big ag fields in an area, that's going to provide food, but not much cover. And then you might get a dense swamp, which, most of the time, unless it's overrun with invasives, most of the time those swamps have a ton of food in them. It's just harder to access and it's not as well defined. But more often than not, there could be a lot of food in those swamps. So just, again, it really depends on the specific situation, which is where that research step or scouting step comes in, where you kind of plug in those things. But if you remove the swamp and you're focusing primarily on topography or a pine thicket, then your cover and your food is completely separated. So really those connecting travel corridors, whatever that cover is that gives those deer a sense of security to move towards food prior to darkness, those are the areas I would really target at least with my scouting efforts. And that's going to help kind of narrow down or create a funnel to kind of, again, pinch those deer down through a more well-defined area.
So and I think that's really good guidance. You've got your 4 key areas of this scientific method, right? If you're talking to kind of round things out, and you were, obviously, you probably do this in your consultations with people, but if someone's listening to this and they say, okay, how do I take those 4 key areas and how do I apply that to the way that I reevaluate or go look at my piece of property? Is there a specific order that you tell them to look in, or is there a specific, I know that you've got, and I don't know the name of it, but I know you've got like an organizational book that is available to people. How would you tell somebody to take those 4 key elements and use them in any specific order to evaluate their piece of property and to look at it differently than they may be looking at it now? Like, where do they start?
The biggest thing with that scientific approach is, again, collecting information and then putting together theories and proving or disproving theories. So you can do it in really any order. I always like to start with the wind. And this is just kind of how I operate when it comes to hunting. Mm-hmm. If I can figure out where a buck is bedded or the general area of where he's bedded, that gives me a huge, huge advantage. We like to think of deer as moving targets all the time. Where's that deer going to come through? Where's he going to end up? But if you focus on learning where he's bedding, then you're really hunting at that time, if assuming it's an afternoon hunt, you're hunting for an animal that's currently stationary. So if his starting point is here and I understand his starting point, then I can put together the pieces of the puzzle to understand where he's going to move from. And that's just the big thing. I mean, the biggest challenge in whitetail hunting, specifically mature bucks, is understanding where they are at any point in time. and when and where you hunt them. So I always start with the wind. So the first thing I would have any customer or client do, and this is actually, on my website, I'm working on some online classes. Right now I've got the step 1 of this 5-step process on there as a free online exercise. And the reason for that is most of my clients, I'll walk through that step right away. So anyone interested in this after listening could go up there and walk through this whole exercise. There's a video on there, but I have them start with mapping out bedding areas. So what do you know without a shadow of a doubt as far as where bucks are bedding on your property, or areas that you think that they're potentially bedding? And a lot of guys, have these conversations and maybe they haven't even thought about it, but like I can dial back 20 years when I didn't really think about it that much, but think about, where were we bumping the most deer or most bucks out of if we were doing a deer drive? Or where's that spot where every time you come through there, you seem to jump deer, whether it's to or from a stand location, to or from a camera location, scouting, walking the dog, whatever you're doing, where are you bumping deer? And then you can kind of drill into a little bit more. Okay, knowing what I know now after listening to a conversation like this or listening to podcasts about where bucks want to bed, where's the cover? More often than not, where's the dense security cover? And again, topography is the greatest form of cover. So I can look at a topo map on most properties and go, what does this area look like? Just based on topography, that's going to offer plenty of cover to these bucks. Now you might be asking, where does the wind element come in there? Bucks, more often than not, and I say that because nothing is 100%, right? They're fair chase, free ranging animals. So there's always fluctuations and anomalies, but more often than not, a mature buck, specifically a mature buck, is going to want to bed with their back against cover. Again, whatever that form of cover is, doesn't matter, but their back against cover and their wind at their back. So if I look at a certain area and understand what the prevailing winds are in that area, which, in the Midwest, it's mostly a westerly wind. I think most of the country is usually westerly during the fall. But southwest is the most prevailing wind we get. So if I look at a topo map, where are the hillsides right now that are facing east? Because that's going to offer a situation where that buck can bed with his back against that cover, being the topography, and the wind at his back. And I can automatically map out certain areas, or just by process of elimination, rule out certain areas where those bucks probably aren't going to bed. And obviously we get fluctuations in the wind, but when we look at the more consistent bedding areas, that's what I would look at first. So I'd always start mapping the wind. Then the next thing I'm going to map out is the food, because if I know where that buck is starting and then I understand where he wants to end up, that can kind of paint that picture. So if I start mapping out food sources from large destination food sources, both on the property and in the surrounding area, relatively close to the surrounding area. And then the smaller food sources, whether it's a food plot that you're installing, maybe a couple old apple trees or something on a property, stuff that you planted, stuff that, grew in an old pasture 100 years ago, whatever it might be. I'm mapping those out. If there's stands of oaks, I don't typically map out like every single oak tree, but if there's a cluster of oaks here, a cluster of oaks there, I'll map those out on my map. The other thing is just limited resources in general. Is there a shortage of water in the area? Then I'm going to mark out any potential water sources, or again, can I add a water hole? What can I do to improve it? So I'll map out that. So I start with those two things. And then what I'll start doing is I'll start mapping the connecting travel corridors. Now, this is assuming that the property is a relatively blank slate. If you already have been hunting the property, then I'll have the client map out existing stand locations as well as their access points. But I always like to start with the wind and then the food, because that combination together will tell me where deer are bedding and where they're feeding. And then you can kind of just draw lines through them. Again, if you follow cover, whether it's topography, follow an edge here or there, you can map out where those travel corridors are, at least roughly. And then when it comes to those stand locations or the pressure side of things, again, whether you already have a stand placed there or you're anticipating or trying to figure out where to place that stand, I always look at it from a couple different perspectives, right? Where do I want that stand to be? Where's the best case scenario or pinch point, right? Where's the best pinch point that I'm going to have the best chance of harvesting a buck if I'm operating under a theory that he's bedded here and he's feeding here? So I can mark that out. Now the next thing is access. And then you just simply ask yourself the questions like, if he is bedded here, can I get past that bedding area to get to that stand location? And if he is feeding here at the end of the day, then can I get past that food source to get out of that stand location? And that's where this pressure thing comes into play. And I refer to it as a stand location pressure audit, right? So you have these stand locations mapped out and you're trying to determine, like, is that a good stand? Well, what makes a good stand? Obviously, a good stand location is a stand that you're going to go in there and kill your target buck, right? That's a good stand. But you get a lot of really good stands that are really only good during a very specific time of the year, or maybe they're really only good for 1 or 2 hunts. And the reason for that is either the deer aren't there during that time of the year because the food source has changed or the bedding area has changed. But more often than not, it's because of the pressure that they put on the property. So I do that stand location pressure audit, and you're asking yourself these questions. Can I get past that bedding area? Again, assuming we're talking about an afternoon hunt. Can I get past that bedding area to get to that stand location without bumping that buck? If the answer to that is yes, I would go for it if you have the intel. But if the answer to the question of can I get past that food source to get out of that location is no, then you really need to understand that you're putting pressure on the property by hunting that location. So that's going to increase the amount of pressure in that stand location, which I would rank that as a higher numbered stand. A lower numbered stand, less pressure; higher numbered stand, more pressure. Again, not saying you can't hunt it. You just have to understand those conditions. And I think that's really important to note, especially with small properties, because you're going to get a lot of stand locations, especially on those small properties, that you can get into them, but you can't get out of them. Or maybe you can get in there in the morning, but you can't get out midday because deer coming from the food source going to the bedding. And that's where you just really need to understand, like, how that property fits in the surrounding area, where those deer start, where they end up, whether it's the morning or the afternoon. And then the timing element really comes into play. And again, a lot of that just, you can base that on historical trail camera data or firsthand observations. I've seen a lot of deer on the property early season, not so much late, or what is the cover? How can my access change throughout the year, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's great. Great information. So Thomas, where can people find you? A, if they want to talk to you about their property, and then B, where can they find you? Where can they access you on social media? That kind of stuff.
Yep. Everything's under the Untamed Ambition. That's my social media handle: YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Whitetail Ambition does have an additional Instagram account, but most of the time I post everything to the Untamed Ambition and share it to that. So you can find me on either one of those. My website is theuntamedambition.com. The Whitetail specific would just be that /Whitetail Ambition, or you can navigate through the site. So if anyone does have questions, you can find all that stuff on there. And obviously this is what I do. And my fall is actually relatively open right now because I already tagged out. So I'm willing.
Don't rub it in, dude. Don't be rubbing it in.
Well, it's, typically, I'm actually typically very hesitant to even promote anything I'm doing during the fall because my schedule could fill up so fast. I'm like, yeah, I'd love to schedule a call with you next week. But, next week is kind of the peak time of the year where I want to be in the woods. And I don't know, because, again, talking about that time frame and those timelines, like I typically, and I think this is something important too to note right now, given the time of the year. And I don't know when this podcast will drop. I'm assuming in the next week or so, but
yeah, next week.
So, it's very important. So we're midway through October, be the latter part of October when this podcast comes out. But if you're trying to plan your rutcation, right, or your rut vacation, now is the time to do that. Actually, you should have done that months ago, and you could have done that months ago. And this all comes down to those 4 key elements, right? So you're looking at the timing element. And that broader scale annual timing is extremely predictable with mature bucks. The more mature a buck is, the more predictable they become. Plain and simple. And that's somewhat assuming that pressure and food, those other 2 important elements on the property, are remaining relatively the same. Food sources haven't changed a whole lot from the previous years. The pressure hasn't increased a ton, or there hasn't been like major changes in cover in general. But if those are relatively the same, the rut is dictated by one thing and one thing alone, and that is when does come into estrus, right? So I was actually just in the process of throwing up a reel on social media to basically say that every single rut prediction that is thrown in front of your face in the next couple of weeks here is complete nonsense. They're all nonsense. And
I'm going to let you finish your thought, but it's funny because, you look at these hunting apps, right? And everyone has a different one that they like for their maps or whatever, but I use HuntWise.
Yep.
And it's got this thing on there, countdown to the pre-rut, right? And on mine, it says the pre-rut starts tomorrow or something. And I've had bucks pushing does for the last 10 days, in the area that I'm in. Like they're already like going at it. So like you said, it's whenever the does come into estrus is when your rut's kicking in.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I like to throw it out there because I don't like it when people have a plan and then they get distracted. And it happens to me all the time. I'll work with a client, spend days helping them put together a plan or a strategy for the fall. And then I'll get a text from them or a screenshot of deer cast and be like, oh, I think I should hunt this week. Like, no. Like that's not even a good win for your property or not a good win for that stand. You're waiting to go after this one specific deer in a very specific area. But the rut in general, again, right now, if you're a guy who has to schedule his time off, which I'm lucky enough that I don't have to do that as much anymore. But there was a long time in my life where I had to plan a minimum of 2 weeks in advance, right? So we're in that kind of 2 week time frame. But yeah, the rut's dictated by one thing and one thing alone. That's when those does come into estrus. From a biological standpoint, the bucks can breed anytime that their velvet's off. I mean, that testosterone increase triggers the velvet, which is essentially the start of the rut. So they're just waiting for the does to come into estrus. So what dictates when does come into estrus? That's dictated by two things primarily. First and foremost, the photo period or the length of the day, right? So that's a very consistent thing. Every year around the same time, the length of the day is the same. It gets shorter and then it gets longer, right? So it's very consistent when does come into estrus on your property. The other factor, which is the more specific thing that I like guys to look into, is the genetic side of things. Obviously not go out and genetically test those deer, but genetics are going to dictate this very narrow window that those does come into estrus. And that's dictated by environmental factors over a long period of time, i.e. evolution. So all you have to do on your property is not overthink it, but if you're hunting a very specific property and you have historical data from that property, this goes all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, where every year that you hunt it, the more information you collect, the better you're going to get at it, right? Just look back, even if it's just last year, I can't stress the significance enough of targeting a specific deer on your property. So if you have a deer that you're after, whether you're going to kill that deer or you've got 3 other deer that you'll harvest on your property, focus on one deer. You're going to learn a lot more. But if you have a deer that you're following on your property, look back over the last couple of years when they were 3, 4, 5 years of age, however old that buck is. But look back, when was that buck in a certain area on your property around a certain time frame? The older they get, the more predictable they are, the smaller their home range becomes. So, when they're a 3-year-old, if they're in an area a lot as a 3-year-old, but they're there a lot less as a 4-year-old, that might tighten up as a 5-year-old. But if you can find that general core area and just notice when they're on the property, again, more often than not, those bucks are just on the property or they're not on the property, especially smaller property. But if you look back at historical trail camera information, whether it's the same buck or just across a more broad time frame of mature bucks in general, you will see very clear patterns of when mature bucks are in certain areas on that property or on the property as a whole. And it's very, very consistent. I mean, I see this all the time on our property. I should note one of the big advantages I have, obviously, again, is having access to a big farm, but I also have a background in wildlife biology, and I also worked for a trail camera company for over 10 years. So I had a research background and I had basically unlimited resources to monitor and scout deer. So I would start putting just a pile of cameras across the farm, which does get overwhelming and is totally in excess, not required to be successful. But what that taught me was, okay, those bucks, in a lot of situations, I have no idea where that buck is at all throughout most of the year. But then all of a sudden, during this 7-day window, more often than not, it's a 3 to 5 day window, that buck shows up in the same corner of the farm every year, year after year. I've got multiple mature bucks that 3-4 years in a row, they would hit the same spot on the property during the same period of time. Sometimes they would come back and they'd linger longer late season. Sometimes they'd be there early season, then disappear and be more consistent during that time frame. But more often than not, you can narrow in using trail camera data, past experiences. You can narrow in on a very specific 3 to 5 day window when your property is going to have the most rut activity. And again, that's based on the does on that property that pass that genetic makeup or that gene on to their offspring to come into estrus around the same time frame. Now, I want to make sure people understand this because you just said you've already been seeing bucks bumping does. I've seen bucks on our farm lock down and breed as early as October 20th and all the way into, late November. A lot of times they're probably on their second or third doe at that point. So I'm really trying to target that first round of does, because those bucks will move into an area. They'll shadow that doe bedding area for a period of time, knowing that those does are going to come into estrus first, and then they're there. They've already got first dibs, right? So focus on that movement more than anything, but it can fluctuate a lot. And I see that on our property. Again, October 20th over in this corner of the farm. You go south, a quarter of a mile, but completely isolated by topography. And this doe bedding group is consistently drawing mature bucks in the first week in November. So it can fluctuate a lot. Again, my advantage was having different options, but also being able to observe all these different options to see the discrepancies there. If you only have one small property to hunt and you've only got a couple cameras out there, look at those properties and go, when do I have the most mature buck activity? That's what I would be timing as far as planning my vacation around that same time frame.
Okay. So just to summarize, DeerCast does not make does come into estrus.
That is accurate.
Okay.
And one last thing that I do want to note, and this is absolutely important, and I'm guilty of forgetting about this all the time. If you're planning things out, right, and that's what I do professionally, is plan things out. I'm sure you do that as well in your professional life, right, as a coach. You're planning these things out. If your rutcation falls on or very close to November 5th, we know how important that day is, right? Think about that ahead of schedule here and apply for an absentee ballot, request that mail-in ballot, whatever you need to do so that you can get in there and vote. I think it's absolutely critical that we vote. We don't need to go into the details on that, but that time frame can generally conflict with some of the best hunting times of the year. So just go ahead and get your absentee ballot, get that submitted so that's done. You don't have to worry about that. But I think it's absolutely important to bring that up.
Yeah, that's a great PSA. I actually looked at, I go to Southern Illinois every November, and I was looking at the dates that I have to leave to go up there and comparing them to the voting day to make sure that I wasn't leaving before voting day because I hadn't gotten an absentee ballot. But I'm good.
No,
I'm good.
And even for me, like I travel about 70 miles to our home farm to hunt, so I have to vote in my township where I'm registered resident. And sometimes I'm like, man, do I need to get out of the stand? Am I going to get to the polls at 10 o'clock at night, right before they close? So, So like I said, just, if there's any shadow of a doubt, just go online. I mean, it's made almost too easy at this point in time to actually vote. Ideally, you go to the polls and show, the responsibility and accountability for that civic duty. But if all else fails, just request the absentee ballot so you get your voice heard.
Yep, absolutely. It's an extremely important election. We need to all get out there and make our voices heard. Thank you so much for being here, Thomas. A great info. Like, this is super, super helpful. I think to going to be to a lot of people. It was great for me, and I really appreciate you taking time to visit with me.
I appreciate you having me on.
See you, brother.
Take care.